Hi, everybody. Today's Wednesday, July 30th, 2025, and our friend John Helmer is back with us. Welcome back, John.
Thank you for having me, Nilma.
Let's talk about the latest news on the part of the relationship between Iran and Russia and the defense, the security, and what's going on. You sent me a link to a website that shows that it seems Iranians received at least one S-400 because they have somehow testing they have tested the S-400 near this city of Isfahan, which we know one of the targets of Israelis and the United States was the city of Isfahan because one of the main facilities of the nuclear program is located there.
Yes.
What's going on? What's your take on that?
Well, we've been talking off air, and as well as you're referring to the piece that's just run this morning in Dances with Bears. Essentially, let's start with the significance. If this report of the first operational testing of a Russian S-400 and anti-missile defense system is correct, then the consequences are politically and militarily very serious, and they're very serious for both Israel and the United States in protecting Iran from further attacks of the kind that President Trump has been threatening, and second, deterring. Now, the question is whether these reports are accurate, and that's the piece that has been running. And what I've been able to do there is to try to track the origin of the initial test reports back to an Iranian military website, which is being misspelled and misreported as the report spreads to military news aggregators in Belgium, in Korea, in the United States, and elsewhere. Two things. One is that, let's just say for the audience, what the initial report says is there's been a significant operational test of this battery. There is no indication of, since these are mobile, where the single battery or more than one battery would be located, but with a 400 kilometer, up to 400 kilometer firing range, this would bring within range of, for the first time, Iranian air defenses, all Israeli and US attack aircraft and fuel tanker aircraft over Iraqi airspace of the kind that were used in the attacks on Iran very recently. The question is whether the reports are accurate, and second, what happened when President Putin called the third telephone call this year to Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. Now, the interesting thing is that we can't do any better at verifying the Iranian missile deployment, if that's what's happening, than I've presently done. Second, what's interesting and notable is that Indian media have begun to pick up the story and amplify it with apparently Indian sources. And the Indian sources, though not properly identified, claim to have detected radar emissions and what are called transport component indicators of the presence of S-400 operationally in Iran. Now, that adds to the possible corroboration. The telephone call between President Putin and Prime Minister Netanyahu on July 28 is very interesting because of what it doesn't say. In the first part, the Kremlin readout refers to a conversation on Syria and on Iran. There's no mention by the Russian president of either the genocide in Gaza or the starvation, genocide by starvation in Gaza, which even Trump and the European leaders and the allies of Israel have all chorused over the last few days. No mention in the Kremlin readout that President Putin referred to that. On the other hand, there are really no indications of why President Putin called the Israeli prime minister at this stage. There's no mention, for example, that the Israeli foreign minister was in Kiev last week promising to increase bilateral relations, and by that is meant Israeli arms supplies to fight Russia on the Ukrainian battlefield. So there are a number of quite serious hostile actions by Israel, which President Putin may have discussed or may have mentioned with Netanyahu. What's doubly interesting, to add to what President Putin does not record himself as having said, is that Netanyahu almost didn't report the conversation at all. Now, that's pretty unusual for the Israelis. There was an immediate reference by Netanyahu to the call having taken place in Hebrew. The English language notification from Netanyahu's office took more than 24 hours. The Israeli press noticed the delay, and when the delay had reached over 24 hours, Netanyahu said in English, as he'd said in Hebrew, the conversation was focused on Iran, but nothing more. If you put the two elements of the news together, what you get is this: that President Putin, and this is speculation, this is a hypothesis, but it's so significant, it's worth emphasizing. President Putin telephoned Netanyahu to tell him that the Iranian press leaks about the deployment of the S-400 are true, and that President Putin told Netanyahu that were there to be any attempt by the Israelis or the Americans to again attack Iran, the S-400s would be fired. And the implication there is that with the S-400s have come several hundred Russian technicians and military experts, first to operate the system, and second to train the Iranians on operating the system for themselves. That means that President Putin is saying for the first time the S-400 and Russian systems and Russian crews will fire on Israeli and American aircraft. That was never said during the significant Russian role in Syria. Indeed, President Putin went to some trouble to point out that he was restricting the Russian S-400s and the other Syrian, lower-level Syrian anti-aircraft defenses from attacking and counterattacking and even defending Syrian territory from Israel. So what's potentially happening here is a significant threshold having been crossed by the combination of Iran and Russia, but not announced with a high degree of accuracy and credibility yet.
John, did you watch the Israeli foreign minister condemning Russia for what's going on in Ukraine and saying they're killing civilians? We condemn that. Is that a show? Is that somehow some sort of political confrontation, or it's not something, it's not a big deal for Russia?
It's a big deal for Russia. I'm rather busy, as are you, and I don't have the time to watch Israelis attacking Russia or Israelis attacking anyone else. I understand what goes on. I don't pretend to explain internal, factional, and party political politics in Israel. So to some extent, like everywhere else, Israeli politicians speak first to their domestic constituents. But as for Israeli active operations against Russia, there's lots of evidence, whether the foreign minister says so, the defense minister, other officials, the Israelis are fully committed to making a very lucrative business selling the means for the Ukraine to make war on Russia. And so what this exposes is a very significant commitment of Israel against Russia, and it exposes the fallacy that's been advocated in Moscow by some elements, some press, some think tanks, and some officials, that Russia has to take care of the Russian population, the Russian-speaking population, the dual passport holding Russian population in Israel, have to safeguard their interests as if they were patriotic. Well, they're not.
But it seems that Israel would be happy if Russia is more involved in somehow busy with the case of Ukraine, that they're not going to be able to have a better somehow new communication with Iran. But after all, John, it's somehow they're trying to make some sort of chaos in the region with the case of Iran, Azerbaijan, and no Armenia, all of this. But after all, don't you think that the outcome of the policies would bring the two parties, I'm talking about Russia and Iran, that wouldn't benefit Israel?
No,
If
quite
you
clearly.
look at Azerbaijan and Armenia and the case of the conflict in that region.
You're quite right. I agree with you. I'm not sure I agree that the Israeli strategic objective and the common complementary US strategic objective is to sow chaos. Rather, it's to achieve their strategic expansion goals. First, for Israel to expand into the Arab world and solidify its hold on Syria. Second, to solidify its territorial and political hold on Lebanon. And then to expand its capability to crush Iranian support for other groups, including the Arab resistance, especially the Houthis, the Yemeni resistance to Israel. And finally, to destroy Iran in its present shape, break it up, partition it, balkanize it, and destroy it as a long-term strategic adversary of Israeli and American expansion in the Middle East. So that's not chaos. That's chaos is a method. The objective is make the empire great again and make the empire an American-Israeli empire in the Middle East. That's the objective. And ultimately, Russia's commitment to support and protect Iran's sovereignty, Russia's commitment to enable Iran to defend itself, was not there in Syria, where Iran was understood on the Russian side to have expanded beyond Iran. But now if Russia defends Iran, if China defends Iran, but if in the present circumstance, if there's a significant, I'll just say, increase in the readiness of Russia to stand by Iran and protect Iran, then what Russia is doing is protecting its own southern front from an American-Israeli expansion. This is becoming increasingly clear as taking a military form for the last more than 10 years. The Russian side has been saying, and often by the Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, that the Russian side would prefer a multi-party Persian Gulf mutual security agreement in which both the Arab side, the Arab states, the Iranian side, and by implication, Israel, would undertake mutual security guarantees to each other, would denuclearize, which means essentially reduce the Israeli nuclear threat, and achieve mutual cooperation without military expansion. That's been the Russian approach. That's why every time Russia makes statements on Israel's aggression, on US aggression in the region, it always stresses the importance of diplomatic, political, and economic cooperation. But this is clearly not either the Trump administration's strategy for the region, nor is it Israel's strategy for the region.
Yeah.
That's military.
John, how did you find the way that Donald Trump is somehow, he said that he's not interested in having a meeting with Vladimir Putin because he sees nothing coming out of the meeting. And here is what he said about the deadline. It was 50 days, and he said that 10, 12 days. Here is what he said.
That you were going to change the deadline from 50 days. So
Yeah.
what is your new deadline? What can
I'm
we
going
expect?
to make a new deadline of about 10 or 12 days from today. There's no reason in waiting. There's no reason in waiting. It's 50 days. I want to be generous, but we just don't see any progress being made.
Mr. President, on guard.
Yeah. What's going on, John? No reason for waiting.
Well, what's going on are two elements of the behavior of the President of the United States. In the first place, he's not the slightest bit interested or even shows he knows what the terms of an end of war settlement might be, or even the Russian terms for ceasefire. He is simply not aware that there are any terms on the table. So when he says they're not interested, what Trump is saying is he doesn't know what interest they've shown. He has therefore ignored every position the Russians have put on the table or offered him: temporary ceasefire for short periods of time, an extended ceasefire on Russian attacks on the electric grid and energy infrastructure of the Ukraine, not reciprocated by the Americans or the Ukrainians. All of these things have been totally ignored by that president. Worse, he doesn't have the apparent cognitive capacity or the political will or the personal interest to reach a negotiation. No, what he said there, as he advertised his own financially failing golf courses are for sale in Scotland, the two of them, as he was advertising his own financial interest for that long weekend, he showed there's only one approach he takes. It's either capitulate or I attack you in force. And by shortening the deadline to August the 8th now and saying Russia's not interested, he's essentially saying the US is not interested in any form of negotiation. Let's go back and remember very quickly how much the Russian side has adapted to these escalating negotiating pressures. Remember, we've talked about it before, that Sergei Lavrov presented to the Secretary of State Marco Rubio a new idea, a new concept, as it was called at the time, which Rubio promised to take back to Trump. Essentially, that meant that instead of the 33 points that Russia has tabled, I mean, everybody can read these points that express the Russian terms for both a ceasefire and a long-term end-of-war settlement and a summit meeting with Trump. All of those elements have been embodied in a very clear set of 33 points. They in turn matched the 22 points that the Ukrainian American side presented through General Kellogg at the same time. And those two sets of papers were exchanged in Istanbul in the last round. but Russia basically offered a shortcut, a prioritizing of the 33 points to the US and said, look, we will come to a ceasefire. We will have the summit meeting. Trump wants to show his, let's say, pseudo Nobel Peace Prize negotiating skills. We'll give you a summit meeting with Putin. We will give you the ceasefire you've been demanding. We will give you the opportunity to grandstand. But here are our priority demands. Stop delivering weapons. Stop providing the intelligence that facilitates the ongoing attacks throughout Russian hinterland at the moment, the Ukrainian drone systems are making, and commit to an election process that removes Zelensky. Those were, let's say, the prioritized, shortcut, new concept, new idea that was last tabled. Okay? Now, when Trump says that, while he's at the same time advertising the ballroom at the Turnberry Golf Course, which is a financial asset he wants to sell or force the British government to subsidize, while he's flogging, huckstering, selling his own financial interests, he says, I'm not interested in any terms the Russian side wants to present. Instead, I'm going to give you 10 days now, and then I'm going to hit you with secondary sanctions, as he's now announced he's beginning to do with India, and he will shortly announce something similar with China. So it's a situation in which Trump proves he is no different from the way in which the Biden administration drove Russia to the war, which began in February 2022. Let's remember what happened then. In December 17, 2021, Sergei Lavrov's ministry tabled 2 treaties for mutual security and peace in Europe and between Russia and the United States. Those treaties were tabled. Everyone can read them and understand what they meant. What did the Secretary of State Blinken do? What did President Biden do? Within 6 weeks, they met again I believe it was in Geneva, if I remember rightly, to discuss the papers, discuss the proposals, but they didn't discuss them. The US side simply dismissed them all without discussion. It was, you Russia, capitulate, or we go to war. That was the trigger. First, the Russians make a negotiating offer. Then the Americans say, we are not interested in dismissing any terms. You capitulate to our demands, or we escalate. And that's what Biden did that triggered the special military operation. And that is triggered, in turn, the destruction of the Ukraine and the demonstration by the Russian military of the capability to destroy any US weapon, US made weapon, or German operated weapon, or British operated weapon on a battlefield for the full length around Russia's borders. What the conclusion you have to draw, as Trump demonstrates, it's his war now. He is pursuing the same capitulation, no negotiations, capitulate or war. What, as Biden did, he is showing that Russia has no alternative. And now Russia has no alternative. The Indian side has no alternative. The Chinese side has no alternative but to fight. And the alternative is the kind of Jeffrey Epstein humiliation model that the European Union president, European Commission president von der Leyen demonstrated in the golf course ballroom on Saturday, and the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, demonstrated on the Sunday and the Monday. They've capitulated, and even the Financial Times, a strong advocate of fighting Russia, has described yesterday and today the capitulation of von der Leyen and the capitulation of Starmer to what they called Trump bullying. Well, if the same formula, no negotiation, capitulate to my terms or else, if is applied to US allies, then we all enter a world of World War III, and that's where we are now.
John, do you feel that it's somehow, looking at Europe and the way that they're behaving, I don't know if we have to be naive to think that they're the way that they're behaving. They have decided to treat Donald Trump the way that you mentioned? Ursula von der Leyen is not about just, we see Starmer the same way. The NATO Secretary General, when they sit next to Donald Trump, there's somehow it seemed a little kid sitting there to get the order from Donald Trump.
Yes.
Why is there any sort of strategy, in your opinion, behind this sort of behavior?
Well, the strategizing that's going on is different from one country to another, from one weak political regime. Let's say the German regime has an election mandate of less than 25% behind Chancellor Merz. The public opinion polls in France show very low public approval of President Macron, and the Starmer landslide election is steadily losing domestic support. So these are weak individuals. As for von der Leyen, as I understood it from my German sources some years back, she was in one of the worst German defense ministers that had served in that post, and was removed to the European Commission out of Germany, where she was incompetent, incapable, and politically weak, a liability to the then coalition government. So she's a weakling too, and it's very far from clear that what do weaklings do in faced with that kind of convincing force? Well, they generally capitulate, but make their retreat look as if it's the best deal they could obtain at the time, and try to make sure that those constituents, business and political, that support them will endorse them, at least in the press for the time being. So what's now got to happen is the answer to your question. In each of these countries, the so-called business interests, the political democracy of France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Spain, Portugal, Greece, and so forth, these countries now have to determine whether they support their weak governments capitulating to the US terms, as von der Leyen has done. Some of the terms she's accepted, for example, the commitment to buy, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere between 600 and 750 billion dollars worth of energy products from the United States, simply can't be implemented. Can't be implemented on the current consumption behavior of the EU. It will take at least 10 years to implement such a commitment. The commitment for the European Union companies, not the governments, to invest $600 billion in the United States, that's a corporate decision not a national decision. Look, Trump heavily pressured Starmer to have the British government subsidize and underwrite more than £100 million worth of infrastructure so that his Turnberry golf course could host the British Open Golf Championship. And he did it over and over, several times over, in the meeting with Starmer. That direct pressure on Starmer didn't quite work. Starmer said, this isn't for me to decide, it's for the golf authorities to decide. In other words, the British government was resisting quietly while publicly demonstrating it was ready to lick Trump's boots. Starmer couldn't have licked harder. He demonstrated what a beautiful ballroom the golf club had, etc., etc. But Trump's whole weekend of pressure forced the British government to improve the financial condition of my golf club, or help me find an investor to buy it at a premium price that constitutes a form of bribery to be paid to Trump in return for official action. If Trump couldn't force the British government to give his golf club the £100 million subsidy he wanted, is he going to be able to force the weakling European states, all of them, to jump in line with Ursula von der Leyen? The likelihood is no, he can't. Therefore, how does a collection of allies that are weak politically and subject to election punishment at home, how do they deal with Trump? Answer, we've seen. At NATO, they agreed to his 5% demand for increased spending, but they want to spin it out for as long as possible, certainly past the expiry date of Trump himself. In other words, lick the man's boots and wait for him to die and hope he dies quickly, at least politically speaking. Wait, delay, and put up a show of capitulation without really meaning to. That's their approach. But they're not at war on the battlefield. Russia is in the war on the battlefield in the Ukraine. And the Russian reaction is, and I better say it emphatically for everybody, the Russian reaction to Trump's behavior is great relief. Relief that he is showing what he really is. He's showing that it's not MAGA, make America great again, it's MEGA, make the empire great again. The entire confidence, hope, optimism that has fueled the Russian readiness to be nice to Trump, not lick his boots like von der Leyen and Starmer demonstrated in Scotland. That approach no longer works. It's obvious to every man or woman or child in the street. And so there's relief that the notion of having to capitulate on any of Trump's terms against Russia has been relieved by Trump's own behavior. That's the relief. Russia has to now concentrate on winning the war in the Ukraine battlefield, as we began, on the southern front and up the northern front, past Kaliningrad, up to Finland, and across to the Far East. Relief that Trump shows his true colors, and those true colors are nothing new. That's the American empire that wants to destroy Russia.
John, how do they see Zelensky and his administration? We know that the new protests in Ukraine somehow managed or somehow prepared by Europeans or maybe the United States altogether. But what do they want to do with Zelensky? Is Zelensky in their mind, do you feel that the Zelensky's case is done, or they want to replace him?
Well, I think the Russian position is very clear. Zelensky is not a legitimate, constitutionally lawful president, and I don't refer to him as president. In my reporting, he's the head of a regime that rules by fiat, by emergency powers under martial law. The Russian terms for a long-term end of war require Ukrainian elections. And that's part of the broader objective of denazification of the regime. What would you like me to say that our audience doesn't already understand very well? The Russian view is that Zelensky represents a combination of individuals like Andrei Yermak, Kirill Budanov, the head of military intelligence, and others who in turn represent a Russia-hating, race-hating ideology that will fight Russia in perpetuity, and that there is no possibility of a stable peace with them. Removing them, however, the first step would be by election. Now, we've seen in the last couple of weeks, we've seen in the last several days, a variety of attempts to undermine publicly Zelensky's hold on power. Now, the Russian interpretation of that is it's a combination of British attempts to promote an alternative candidacy. General Zaluzhny is the obvious candidate. It may represent an American attempt to revive the presidential comeback of Pyotr Poroshenko, the former president. Both of those possibilities are being neutralized as we speak by Zelensky and Yermak. And so you go to the British press and you go to the American press and you go to the Ukrainian press to see what alternatives to Zelensky they think would continue the war against Russia. The so-called anti-corruption campaign is interpreted on the Russian side by major Ukrainian voices like Oleg Tsarov, a major Ukrainian opposition leader who lives in the Crimea. The anti-corruption campaign has been understood to be not so much remove Zelensky, but to remove the power of Yermak and the others around him and reduce Zelensky to the kind of a comic figurehead, a powerless figurehead, where he began, but not to produce peace with Russia. Honor, it's to produce a continuation of the war by other individuals, possibly with Zelensky remaining as a figurehead. That's one of the interpretations on the Russian side. But ultimately, as we've seen, the Russian side has to accept it can't trigger elections by political means, by negotiation. And if Trump and the American side continues on their present course, the only options are available to the Russian side are military ones. And so we return to the demilitarization objective of the special military operation. And we reserve denazification to bottling up the Zelensky-Yermak-Budanov combination in and around Lvov, west of Kiev to the Polish border. Bottle them up and prevent them from waging their in perpetuity war against the Slavic race, against Russia, by putting half of the Ukraine territory under demilitarized zone restrictions and conserving and rebuilding the east of the Ukraine as part of Russia.
John, we had a Ukrainian journalist, his Ukrainian opposition journalist in exile. He reported, and Anatoly Sharia, I don't know if I'm not pronouncing his name correctly, but he said that Zelensky, it seems that there are some sort of chaos within the administration between differences between Yermak and Zelensky. And behind the scenes, seems that Yermak is trying to coordinate with Zelensky, with these people, and even there were some sort of rumors that Zelensky wants to dismiss Yermak from his position. Do you feel that could be the case? You may have some sort of chaos within the administration. Zelensky is not that. We know that Zelensky is not that much powerful when it comes. Yermak was somehow the very important figure in the administration. I would argue. Is that, do you feel that these sort of reports coming out of Ukraine does it have anything to do with the reality of what's going on?
I can't pretend to be an expert any longer without the Ukrainian sources I once had. So I'm not trying to duck the question. I'm simply saying I'm not going to speculate based on my ability to read second or third hand. And nothing, I can only emphasize to our audience, nothing you read about the politics of Kiev, like nothing you read in the Western press about the politics of Moscow, can be taken at face value. There's obvious campaign in, let's say, major mainstream media connected to the British government, like the Financial Times, which is also connected to the Japanese government, which owns the paper through Nikkei. You've got an obvious effort to reduce the power of Andrei Yermak in the Zelensky regime. Remove him? Well, ask yourself, if as a result of your campaign, he got rid of Shmyhal, the prime minister, and replaced him with his candidate, that's a failure. That means that peaceable methods for renovating the Zelensky regime won't work against Yermak and his supporters. We then return to something like the end of the Vietnam War methods, which involved assassination and virtually forcible replacement of presidents. Those who didn't die were given the opportunity to live in comfort and in retirement in the United States. Have we reached that point in the Ukraine? I don't know yet, but we are at war. When we're at war, everything that you read is likely to be a form of information warfare. So what some people see as planned change will look like chaos to others, will look like the rise and fall of this faction or that outside force, MI6 or CIA or other elements, outside elements pushing their particular candidacies. We won't waste our audience's attention span on that sort of speculation. And as for the sorts of reports that one can read about secret meetings of this one or that one, planning to remove this one or that one, one can't tell how much of that's planted to discredit the names in the reports or some other form of information warfare and deception. We can't take that seriously any more than one could take the many speculations of plotting against Hitler. Until the bomb went off under the table but didn't kill him, you couldn't say very much about the forces of the good Germans trying to remove Hitler and reach some sort of peace accommodation with the Allies and the Soviet Union, short of capitulation. Short of capitulation, we will see this sort of rumor mill that until the bomb goes off on or under the table in Kiev, with whatever result that might have, you don't have a significant regime change. And while we're at war, the terms on the table have been dismissed now by the United States, and therefore we go to something really simple. It's capitulation. Capitulation.
John, before wrapping up this session, do you feel that in the eyes of Russians, is there any sort of difference between Zelensky and Zelensky?
Oh, speaking as a Russia correspondent, I can't say. The issue, but speaking as a political scientist or as a journalist, let's look at the method that you'd use to answer the question. First of all, you'd ask, who's in Zelensky's team? And who's in Zelensky's team? You would take an approach behind those teams. Who are the oligarchs? Who are the economic interests at stake behind each of the team members and behind each of the teams as a collective? And you would then predict how much ongoing war with Russia might suit one team versus the other team. That's financial benefits, corrupt profiteering, and what have you, and the removal of, let's call it, opposition forces, so that though the war's being lost, the political gains in Kiev or in Lvov favor one team or another. And we're not counting Mrs. Tymoshenko, and we're not counting former President Poroshenko or the mayor of Kiev, Klitschko. We're not counting all the potential players, and I'm no doubt left out various other team members and their team leaders that play into this conflict. I leave it out because I'm not going to speculate about what I don't know. What I'm offering is a method for thinking to answer your question. And if we can't get any evidence to apply to that method, we got to say we don't know. But we go back to how simple war is. When the head of the other side, the enemy side, President Donald Trump, says, I don't care, I give you 10 days to capitulate, there's no difference between him and any of these teams. Russia has to advance on the battlefield while trying to talk. We got to come to the simple conclusion now today that the combination of sweet nothings which President Putin has offered Trump, the combination of sweet nothings and advancing on the ground through Pokrovsk towards Dnipropetrovsk, towards Kiev, the combination of drone and missile attacks to destroy all military infrastructure that threatens Russia. That combination is now obsolete. The Putin policy of sweet nothings has failed. It failed in the Turnberry Golf Club ballroom when Trump said, they're not interested, I'm not interested. And once we're at that point, we're at the same point that it can't matter whether Zelensky, Poroshenko, Zaluzhny, or another figure fights each other, whether MI6 and CIA can concert their activity. This doesn't matter. The issue has to be regime change as part of a capitulation, the disintegration of the armed forces to go on fighting. They come to the table, whether it's in a train carriage, as Hitler imposed on the French, or on the deck of a battleship, as MacArthur imposed on the Japanese. It doesn't matter. Let them figure out who's going to sign the articles of capitulation. That's for them. It's for our side to determine that we will protect our security, the security of the Russian Federation in its new borders, the protection of the demilitarized zone as deep as required to prevent this endless drone war on Russian territory, and the political outcome in Lvov or between Kiev and the Polish border will be up to that lot to settle, as along with the Poles, the Hungarians, and the Romanians, the nearby neighbors, to determine how they should manage their affairs together in a landlocked country which has no access to the sea and can only export a very limited range of commodities, which neither Poland nor the rest of the European Union want to take at dumping prices. That's their problem. They wanted a war to destroy Russia. They end up destroyed themselves. Let them pick up the pieces.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Thank you very much for having me, Neiman. See you next time. Let's see if there's any change in this prognosis we've been discussing today on the Iran front or on the Ukraine front.
Yeah, exactly.